actually, I don't think the youth of today is all that different from the youth of earlier years. But there are some illusions which it's worth eliminating. There's a conception that the youth of the 60s, your age, was very active, involved, engaged, demonstrations, protests, so on. And it's not false, but it was true for a very short period. It wasn't the 60s, it was roughly 67 to 71, end of the 60s. And that left a big impact. Before that, young people were very passive and apathetic. And it was very, in the 50s, it's a very quiet period. In the 60s, things picked up a little bit with the civil rights movement. But the civil rights movement was something down there, you know, racist Alabama sheriffs and things like that. And the civil rights movement was extremely important, but it was pretty narrowly focused. And when the civil rights movement moved from the focus on extreme racism in the South up to the North, it died. You can see that on Martin Luther King Day, when King is celebrated. Just listen to the speeches. They talk about his "I Had a Dream" and voting rights in the South and so on. There's very little said about Martin Luther King from about 1965 on. At that time, King turned to the North, and he turned to broader issues, class issues. When he was assassinated, he was organizing a Poor People's Demonstration in Washington. In fact, he was assassinated at a sanitation workers' strike in Memphis. And when he moved in those directions, he turned strongly against the war in Vietnam. That part of his life is mostly excised because it was getting too close to home. The student movement, young people's movement, did pick up at that point a focus on Vietnam. And it was very significant, important, left a big imprint on the country. But I think the major activist movements came later. So the women's movement, for example, which probably had more effect on the country than any other, that's mostly a product of the 70s. The anti-nuclear movement took off in the 80s. Sometimes called the global justice movement. It's called anti-globalization. It's not what it is. It's a global justice movement, which is now quite substantial. That's the last 10 or 15 years. And in fact, if you count the number of activists, young activists, there are probably more now than there were in the past. So the idea that it's sort of an apathetic, passive generation just it doesn't seem at all true. I mean, I can just see it in my own activities. You know, I give talks all the time. We get huge audiences, a lot of interesting people, whether it's on immigration, on Palestinian rights, on the uprisings in the Middle East, on the workers' rights here. It's much larger than before. So, and there are difficulties now that there weren't at that time. And they're not accidental. The activism of the late 60s did frighten elite elements. So did something that's not too well known, the liberalism of the Nixon administration. Nixon was the last liberal president. And in his administration, legislation was enacted which carried forward the New Deal and Great Society measures and really frightened the business world. Regulation, support for legislation supporting workers' rights, poor people, and so on. All of this, together with the activism in the 60s, led to a big backlash. There was a major effort from that point on to try to reintroduce discipline into the society, return people to passivity. It was very overt. You could read it in published books and articles. And part of the concern was students. If you check back, you'll find that that's the time when tuition started to rise. By now, tuitions at colleges are astronomical. Most states, by now, the public system, the state system, getting more funding from tuition than it is from state governments. And it's essentially a policy of killing public education and turning it and privatizing it. Same thing's happening on the lower schools. Major effort to try to destroy the public school system and privatize it. Well, you know, there are a lot of reasons for this. For one thing, it tends to restrict it to more privileged people, which is beneficial to the wealthy. And for another, it's a disciplinary effect. I mean, if you go through college and you come out with $50,000 in debt, you're going to have a lot of constraints on what we can do. In the 60s was quite different. That was a period of, the post-war period, 40s, 50s, 60s, were a period of economic expansion. It was a vibrant society. The economy was growing, biggest growth period in American history. It was pretty egalitarian growth, so the lowest quintile did about as well as the upper quintile. There were welfare state measures coming in. A student in, say, your age, in, say, mid-60s, could decide, okay, I'm going to take off a couple of years and get involved in the civil rights movement or the environmental movement or something or other, and then I'll come back and I'll continue my career. You can't assume that. Unless you're disciplined and obedient, you can get cut out. And there's a whole host of disciplinary measures. Tuition's just one of them. And it does impose constraints. Also, the job market is totally different. That was a growing economy. You figured you'd have a good chance to go ahead and get a decent job in your own choice, in your own profession or whatever it is. And now you can't assume that. And that also has disciplinary effect. So students are facing harder constraints, a lot of them imposed in order to institute discipline, but they're there. And nevertheless, I think activism is, I'd say, greater probably than in the past.